Hello, 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 hello. It is your good friend, Wild Philosopher, here once more to remind you that fairies are real. Here today with my good friend Ryan Rose, and we got an interesting stream tonight because we will be talking about what'd you call it? Well, we'll be talking again about another popular theory in folkloristics that we don't think holds much water. But the main reason, I guess, or the reason we did this stream is not, namely, we will be talking about the theories of Adrienne Mayer, who has, she has some fancy name for the position again, like paleomythology, mythopaleology.
Uh, I think the term she used was geomythology.
Yes,
Geomythology.
yes, founder of geomythology. Or not founder, but certainly the most vociferous and sophisticated defender, which is the view, namely, that myths are a sort of proto-scientific exploration of the natural world. Specifically, their famous claim is that gryphons are based on dinosaur bones. I think she was Cyclops is a mammoth skull. That was her, yes.
Pardon? Oh, her view on like Cyclops. Yeah, no. She didn't. I guess she founded a modern revival of it. She made several theories, or I guess innovative theories in the field. One of which is trying to connect the gold guarding griffins of Hyperborea to skeletons of Protoceratops around the region. She's more the head of a revival because it was posited some years ago, I think even going as far back as the early 1920s, that the possible origins of mythic creatures like Cyclops and giants, but to that extension, are to be found in like pygmy elephant skulls lying around certain islands in the Mediterranean. So, in the case of the Cyclops, later Greek tradition holds that the Cyclops were on the Isles of, I think, Sardinia and Sicily. Although I think mostly Sicily. I think the Lystrogonians were on Sardinia. But yes, Sicily was the origin of the Cyclops. But that's again according to a later Greek tradition, more closer to the age of Greek rationalists, who tried, I guess, fixating or pinpointing regions in the Odyssey to regions they were familiar with in their time.
Yes. So as might be clear, Ryan is really going to be the expert in Mayer's views here. He has read a lot more of her than I have. I will be turning the floor over to him for much of the stream in a moment. Before we get into that, and while we still have a whopping 0 viewers, always my favorite part of the stream, I'm just going to give a very quick overview of like, why do we care about this theory? Like, why are we presenting on it? And mostly because our goal here is not necessarily to dismember Mayer's arguments, although we certainly intend to do that, as much as it is to analyze the sort of hermeneutic or epistemic footsteps that led her to these positions. Namely, the sort of tendencies towards rationalization and the concoction of theories for natural phenomena, or sensible phenomena. Mostly because one of the interesting things about folkloristics, and one of the reasons we talk about folkloristics so often on this channel, is that most people believe that fairies aren't real. Right? Most people do not think that griffins ever existed. Not simply in academia, but also outside academia. which means there's no pressure on academics, either within or without the field, to present strong arguments for their anti-realistic views. Compared to, say, it's broadly the consensus in Indology that Hinduism doesn't exist, a premise not shared by Hindus. And so you're going to end up with academics having to present stronger arguments for that view to their prospective audience, which will, of course, include a lot of people who are following the philosophy academics think doesn't exist. So yeah, compared to that, nobody, or at least I shouldn't say nobody, but it's a very small percentage of human beings, and certainly a very even smaller percentage of philosophical human beings who believe fairies are real. So there's no pressure to sort of design strong arguments for your views in folkloristics in the way there is elsewhere. And this means that folkloristics, as much as I love the field, can unfortunately it can be plumbed rather extensively for examples of terrible argumentative structures that you see in all sorts of other places, but which aren't nearly as clear as they are in folkloristics. All right, so we'll be talking about the sort of overt rationalization, and as I said, schematization that you see in some folklorists. But you get this in all sorts of other fields, and our concern is less with the question of whether or not gryphons were wandering about the ancient Mediterranean 3,000 years ago than it is with how we think now. And when I encounter claims or when I encounter problems, how do I approach those problems? Am I going to grapple with the features of the claim, try and find out the context, look at these charitably, look at them from within my opponent's perspective, or am I going to pull a piece of legerdemain and replace them? And you see this all the time in, as I said, just everywhere outside of folkloristics. I will refrain from giving any wildly controversial examples, but I could name 30 off the top of my head. In politics, religion, economics, heck, just going about our day-to-day lives, we all do this, so. Hence, also not blaming anyone for anything, in case this stream gets watched by people, and they're like, oh, it's like, no, I've done this too. But yeah, that's our sort of concern here. What is the hermeneutic with which we think about things? Unless you have anything you want me to add on to that prelude, Ryan, I will hand the floor to you to present Mayer's position.
Sure thing. All right. So again, for people who aren't in the know, Adrienne Mayer is sort of famous for a couple of things, mostly for her theories on fossils and their potential or presumed connection to Greek myths. She led a sort of revival in the field of what we call geomythology, which is basically assuming beforehand that there's a connection between myths and geological or paleontological features, and trying to ascribe some kind of root in natural phenomenon to these myths. For instance, there have been theories floating around, or there are theories proposed, I should say, that the dragon slain in one of the in the Sigurd, the one involving Sigurd, the dragon that he slew in its location, the cave that it inhabited. The theorists, geomythologists, theorists will try to point to, let's say, remnants of dinosaur footprints as evidence, let's say, of that. So ancient poets or people who believed in these things, they would look at these prints, and they would concoct a story around them. And that's essentially her theory, is people will look at natural features, biological features, paleontological features, and then they will apply some kind of interpretation to them, and then that is sort of the basis of fantastical superstition, which is, I guess, a gross misrepresentation of the paleontological data.
Yes.
But since
And
it's like a form of primitive science, well, they couldn't have known any better. So that's where mythology comes from.
and to give and I guess another instance of this type of argument totally out of this field, you see the same with creationists, right?
Yes,
Not to
funnily enough.
accuse Mayer of being a creationist, of course, but you see the identical structure with creationists. The only difference being that they think the dinosaurs were still around
Yes,
for
yes,
people to look at. Um,
yes.
and
Funnily enough, the creationist interpretation of data is remarkably familiar to what a skeptic or, I don't know, a rationalist might use to interpret mythology. So, food for thought, I suppose.
yeah,
um, but that is her theory in general. And she made, I guess, a large or fairly interesting enough claim of trying to, uh, let's say, connect the gryphons of Greek lore to fossils or fossil remnants, in particular Protoceratops. She details this discussion in her book. She actually wrote a book in the early 2000s called the First Fossil Hunters: Dinosaurs, Mammoths, and Myths in Greek and Roman Times. Um, and I think this was one of her, I think her first major publication. So she wrote this back in the 50s, or back in her 50s, sorry. Um, which is to say, no matter your age, you can always make some kind of a turn in your career, which is fun, hopeful for the rest of us. But
yes,
um,
falsifying Greek beliefs already.
yeah, yes,
So, for those
uh,
unaware, the Greeks held that a man reached his apogee at age 40 and would never contribute anything thereafter.
uh, that's funny. So yeah, that was her big discovery, which kind of put her on the map, I suppose, in the field of anthropology and classics, right? So her field of expertise is in classics. Um, she doesn't have a degree in classics. Her only degree, I think, her only degree is a bachelor's in printmaking, and she started out in artistry. But I guess you could say she's an autodidact of sorts, and came to her position through vigorous reading and whatnot. So no fault to her for anyone else if they lack a degree. Um, so that's kind of her background. And so yeah, like I said before, her big discovery, which put her on the map, was trying to connect Protoceratops fossils to um, the accounts of griffins in Greek myth. And by accounts of griffins, really it goes back to one person. Actually, it may have actually it might go back a bit earlier, but Herodotus, I think, was the major source for that in the ancient Greek world, a major, let's say, academic source, um, and
We
that sort of proliferated kind of from what he reported.
fun fun fact, we've actually for those just watching this channel for the first time, we have analyzed this same passage from Herodotus twice now on two totally different topics.
Yes,
Because
yes,
the story, yeah, the encounter with the griffins is in the story of Aristeas,
yes,
which you will find on our legendary Hyperborea stream.
yes. So if you haven't seen that, I would suggest going to see that, um, and then maybe come back later, or whenever. But because that'll really help to contextualize this discussion. but you don't need it totally because we'll probably be reiterating a lot of what's been said already in that stream. Uh, but yeah, that's where. But the griffins, however, griffin imagery goes back a long time. It's actually possibly quite possibly prehistoric. Griffin imagery is actually rooted in Egyptian iconography and has been found on ancient Egyptian palettes, which kind of they were palettes for you know the use of makeup and dyes and textiles and what have you. Um, and these palettes, they depicted a lot of fantastic imagery. One of those imageries being griffins, and those are at least prehistoric. Or by prehistoric, I mean pre-literate Egypt, which is probably around the time of the pre-dynastic era, when hieroglyphs were just starting to be employed or being used. Sorry, in the Egyptian world, they do go back to at least 3000 BC, maybe just before that. And so griffin imagery is actually very ancient. You also see it show up in Minoan iconography. So at least dates back in the Greek world, in the Aegean world, it dates back to at least the latter half of the late Bronze Age. And so in terms, I mean, the imagery itself, the inherited imagery, is fairly ancient. It is fairly ancient, very Mediterranean, very ancient. Um, but for Adrienne Mayer, her argument in the way the Greeks approached griffins, right? Like griffins in Scythia, because Aristeas, he notes that when he traveled to this region, he noted that there was a tribe of Scythians which actually hunted these griffins so that they could gain access to their gold stores. They had nests inlaid or laid with gold, which they guarded. And these hunters, covetous as they were, attempted to gain access to these gold stores by hunting the griffins. Um, so Adrienne Mayer, in her quest to try to sync her, these bones, or sorry, these myths of griffins with bones in the ground. She actually made several attempts at trying to connect them to various Greek or to various other species. So the Protoceratops was not actually the first creature she supposed was the origin um, for the griffins in Scythian mythology. What she purported was the original, or what was her original thesis was, I think, Triceratops bones um, and other ceratopsid species. Um, of course, this didn't work out correctly because they were usually in the wrong spot, or they were too large with what or with how the griffins were being described. So she moved on to other species until she found the Protoceratops, which she thought was a fit for for the griffin. And she supposed that okay,
Credits
maybe
for falsification.
yeah, yeah, um,
Yeah.
yeah. But then so that was her argument. Is this myth of griffins guarding gold is rooted in like Scythian or even like the discovery um, of 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 fossil remains and attempting to concoct a story around them. Usually from the Scythians. She actually the major deposits or false like the fossil beds which actually contain these bones are typically found in Mongolia. And I think she tries to stretch her sources a bit to include Mongolia, because I don't think there actually aren't any Protoceratops deposits in, let's say, the region what the Greeks may have originally thought these bones were in, supposedly. Um, so, I mean, part of the reason I bring that up is, her theory is, it's got problems. It's got problems, and this is part of the reason why these kinds of explanations are kind of a bit off the wall, and they misrepresent, in my opinion, what the uh, contents of these myths are. So, for instance, her argument on griffins, like griffin imagery, because it's so ancient. We know what the origins are, for these, fantastical looking creatures. Um, and her argument, like, I guess you could say that the idea of griffins or griffin imagery already existed in the Greek mind, but that as a way of, I guess, trying to reify the myth of the griffin in actual, in reality, and ancient peoples, they sort of misinterpreted uh, fossils in the ground to account for their views, um, or at least account for their superstitions, and in attempting to make them real. Um, but the problem is, of course, that, well, first of all, the actual problem is the account of the griffins and where they come from. Actually, it's unfortunately, I think her methodology is very flawed here because she leaves out a kind of a crucial detail in her description of Griffin gold hunters, or Griffin hunt, ancient Scythian gold hunters. The tribe that was actively fighting the Griffins were said to have been a tribe of one-eyed people. They were called the Aramazpians. And it literally, according to Herodotus's etymology, it could be a folk etymology, but according to the etymology he gave, it derives from the Scythian terms for one, and one an eye, like arima, uh, or arima. I forget the words, but it derived according to his account, from the Scythian word for one-eyed, or one-eyed people. Um, and that's kind of crucial because, like, the image being depicted here is obviously very, fantastical, um, and I think some precaution is necessary for trying to rationalize the account, because obviously you're not being given a kind of rational description of what's going on. Like, the Greeks obviously knew there were a bunch of, two-eyed people in northern Scythia. But I think when you have that sort of dyadic pairing of one-eyed people hunting, griffins who are guarding their layers of gold, that requires a little more of, maybe not skepticism, but awareness of potential, like cult awareness, because imagery like that is not, it's not trying to account for a rational, let's say, naturalistic phenomenon. It's self-contained imagery. It's imagery. In fact, you actually see this theme of bird hunters in Greek myths in several places. Homer gave his account, and I think Herodotus repeats it. But Homer, going back to Homer, he gave his account of pygmies which fought storks at sort of the ends of the earth. You also see Heracles and the Argonauts fighting. Um, uh, mythic magical birds during their quests, or their ventures. So the mythology of let's say, ritualistic bird hunting is replete with, again, cultic mythic imagery, and is repeated several times in Greek myth. Um, an awareness of Greek religion kind of needs to be had beforehand, before doing any of these kinds of interpretations. Um, Also, one of the bigger problems is the again um, uh, Griffin Aristeas himself. That is the actual source which Herodotus gets his information from. It's Aristeas. Now, of course, he lived, I think, about 2 or a century and a half before Herodotus it did. So he's not
Right.
actually, you know, interviewing Aristeas. But
And
what? Sorry.
and that date is assuming his full lifespan of 300 years is correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when we said he lived 100 years before Herodotus, it's 400 to 300 to 100 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Long lived fellow, 300 years old.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, he was seen, Aristeas was seen visiting taverns hundreds of years later. According,
But
of course, to the same sources that are giving us the Griffin battle.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were confusing maybe with Epimenides, but okay, okay.
No,
Oh,
Aristeas and Epimenides were both alive for hundreds of years.
yes, yes, okay, yeah.
Sorry, Epimenides is another legendary. I think he lived, what was it, 500 years?
No, 299.
200, yes, 200. Legendary Greek religious thinker, political theorist, and I think he was a Rip Van Winkle because he slept for decades in the cave of Zeus. But sorry, that aside, back to the Griffins.
Yeah, okay, okay. Yeah, so, potential hundreds of years old. Yeah, so Aristeas, his account, and again, if you actually go back to the stream we did on Hyperborea, has all the classic details of a vision quest. So he's not actually like going on some expedition to northern Scythia to sift out or to sift through bone deposits. He's actually undertaking a visionary episode. Not that he actually isn't going to Scythia, but it's spiritual. It's
The final.
Yeah.
Oh, the
It's
final. Oh, sorry.
okay. No, it's good. You can go.
I was going to say the final nail or nail of evidence for the visionary argument, for the record, is the fact that Aristeas was renowned as a visionary traveler.
Yes.
Who would leave his body in the form of a raven.
Yeah, and travel with Apollo.
Yes, well, also very Hyperborean. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. No, like you can't talk about the Griffins without talking about Hyperborea because they're interlinked. And Hyperborea, as it's described, we might call that as another world, which in folklore, typically Celtic or Britannic, even Germanic folklore, but usually in folklore, the other world is sort of the plane of existence or realm of the fairies, realm of the gods. It's sort of it's Earth, but also not Earth. It's sort of this transcendental realm. Um, and Hyperborea has a lot of those elements. It has a river coursing through it, which symbolically rivers have strong liminal ties. It's an everlasting garden, kind of an everlasting paradise. Its people are long lived. They're associated with swan imagery, as is the titular god who lives there, Apollo. Um, it it's an everlasting spring. It's sort of in the ancient Greek mind, at least prior to the era of the rationalists, you have this, you have a lot of this flavorful language which, talking about the ends of the earth and how the ends of the earth, the edges of the known world are kind of fantastic and beautiful, and you see this repeated a couple times in Greek myth. You
Was
have
it?
pardon.
Sorry, was it Herodotus or was it one of our other main sources which said that you could reach the moon from Hyperborea?
That was a later source.
That was a later source.
That was a later source.
Hecataeus Fabdera.
Yeah, I think so. That was Hecataeus. Yes.
Only about 100 years later.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you can reach the moon um, from from Hyperborea. Maybe that's how Mohammed arrived. uh, just
See that on stream.
yeah. He went to the moon. Maybe that's how he did it. Um, I mean, yeah, he flew on a horse to Medina. He was a shaman.
Okay, don't say it. Okay,
Okay, okay,
gonna get us canceled.
okay. Hey, I am. I know a lot of people. I mean, I could take that seriously. I could take that
Oh,
seriously.
well, yeah, you could take it seriously.
Yeah.
I do, um, and not in a negative way, in case
No, not at
anybody's
all.
listening. But some people will lose their marbles. So.
Yeah, I know, I know, I know. Just for having fun. Don't take it seriously. But yeah, so um, where was it? Yeah, so it's Hyperborea is like the word Hyperborea means extreme north or far to the north. I think that's how it's translated. Um, and again, it has all that edges of the known world imagery involved, and the fact that griffins are associated with it. So they guard the roots, or sorry, they like the edges of Hyperborea are actually said to be guarded by a ring of mountains, I believe, or at least a wall of mountains, and those are usually called the Riparian Mountains. Griffins sort of guard the griffins in Aristeas' account. They guard sort of the edges of that garden. They guard those mountains, and the tribe, which attempts to pilfer uh, their gold stores, they are called the Arimaspians, and they make regular assaults on on those mountains in order to gain the gold. Um, so once you have that in mind, and you start comparing Hyperborea to other edge of the world fantastical realms, then you kind of you start to see what's actually being described here, and it's not fossil bones. Again, it's a vision quest, it's a a visionary account.
Yes, which is one of
It's
the most. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. Do you mind if I cut in here?
no, that's fine, that's fine.
Yeah, because when you were telling me when we were reading through Mayer, you were going over some of our arguments. That was I always remember that was the thing that stuck out to us the most was we have an exceptionally complex theory, which again, to her credit, she has tested and falsified in at least a couple cases. Um, for something that really, from a purely skeptical angle, doesn't need a theory.
No.
Like, skeptics do not believe in the reality of visionary quests. And you don't, especially not when told by people who claim to have left their bodies in the form of a bird. And, while we would certainly take them seriously on that channel, if only for philosophical reasons, it is a little weird to come up with such a robust and sophisticated skeptical argument when you could just say a hallucination and be done with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like you really, there's a better skeptical theory to account for the accounts of griffins, and that's just they made it up. They
Yeah,
made it
I
up.
mean,
They
yeah,
made it
like
up.
we're not big fans of that type of argument in general on this channel, but I think it would be silly to say that it's not true in some instances. And I
Yeah,
think people might reasonably be justified in applying that to ones that claim impossible species are real.
yeah,
If give skeptics their due, which is if you don't mind my shifting the conversation a little,
that's fine.
I think that was, unless you wanted to give a couple other examples.
I did. Yeah.
Okay, I was gonna say because that really gets, there's the meat and potatoes of our disagreement here is on 2 points, which I'll bring up briefly before handing the floor back to Ryan. which is namely this is an exceedingly strange form of rationalization. Not in the sense, yeah, extreme form of rationalization, and B, this is just not how things are done in Greek myth. It's not a really compelling account of Greek myth, either as read as literary works or as sort of lived mythological texts, especially once you start getting into the actual ancient Greek religious observances. Then it all falls to pieces.
Oh yes.
So yeah, if you, I think we reasonably covered the Griffin instance.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
if you'd like to come up, use another one or two examples, and then we'll.
Well, there's the other famous examples, which I actually think has more traction in popular media, which is the idea of the Cyclops, the giant or giants or group of man-eating giants, which are mentioned in sorry, I'm hiccuping, which are mentioned in Hesiod and in Homer's work in the Odyssey. Um, she also links or makes attempts to link the Cyclops with the finding of like pygmy elephant skulls, which so in later Greek accounts, the giants, the Cyclopses from Homer's Odyssey, were thought to have inhabited Sicily. There, there was also another group of giants which lived in Sardinia, the Lystragonians. But for the purposes of our argument, we're going to stick to the usual. It's so there, in later Greek accounts, again, the Cyclops lived on Sicily, and Adrian Mayer, I think, rather uncritically accepting these accounts, she attempts to link that tradition with the pygmy elephant bones, which are found on the Isles of Sicily and in Sardinia too, in fact. She attempts to account for it by looking at the skull of an elephant, and it's vaguely cyclopic, so you could suppose that well, the bones which they found, you know, they had a priori they already had cyclopic or views and beliefs in the Cyclops, and then just ascribed that belief to these bones, or even that this was the actual, let's say, origin point, the origin point for belief in giants, and it was over misdiscovery or discoveries, misidentifications with elephant fossils. So that's also her argument, and that one again has more and more traction in the media, from what I've seen. That one is also equally as problematic, but for the reason that in the Homer's Odyssey, we actually we don't really know the island which Polyphemus and the other Cyclops inhabited, and it's only later Greeks attempting to pinpoint where in reality the Odyssey took place. Uh, that it was they tried to assign Sicily, or assign that travel to Sicily, because it was in their immediate geography and they kind of knew where it was. Because the Odyssey is a rather difficult read when you're trying to trace its geographic trajectory, and can be very difficult to make heads or tails of. So the later Greeks just kind of threw up their arms, and they're like, okay, it's got to be Sicily. Uh, in later Greek traditions, you also see attempts of assigning Oceanus, the Earth encircling river, or rationalizing it as the Atlantic Ocean. Again, rivers or oceans at the ends of the Earth. Oh well, the Atlantic Sea is kind of at the edge of our known world, so that's what the Earth encircling ocean is. It's Oceanus. Sorry, it's the Atlantic Ocean.
And
Um,
specific.
Again, I'll just pop that off. Very trendy in that era. Very trendy. But
Yeah,
you no, you can go.
I was going to say it's yeah. Because when we say later Greeks, um, you have to. Most of us, when we look at Greek myth, we learn it. Well, I mean, we're learning it through censored, frankly, censored versions of Homer, Hesiod, some of the other really early poets like Pindar, and then one or two late Roman poets, especially Ovid.
Yeah.
He has been huge, justly as a well deserved reputation amongst everyone except academics. Uh, but anywho, but after sort of after the fourth century, you had a turn to what we would call rationalism in Greek thought, which doesn't mean that they started thinking. It means they started engaging in attempts to call disassemble religions of their supernatural or non-apparent meanings and reveal the hidden naturalistic or scientific roots underneath. Right.
Hmm.
This gets started with Euhemerus, who I often see put in the lineage of the Cyrenaics, although I haven't found a primary source for that. But yeah, possibly part of the Cyrenaic school, which was the predecessor to Epicureanism. And Euhemerus famously claimed, on the basis of forged evidence, that all the gods had really been mortal men who were then deified. Uh, I mean, his book didn't survive. We only actually have, I think, two passages from it that are just quoted ad nauseum by later writers.
Yeah.
But he did birth a sort of movement of rationalist exegesis of the myths. This often gets associated with the intelligentsia. That is true, but it needs to be clarified that it's a very specific type of intelligentsia here, because you're not going to find this if you're looking at Platonists reading myth in the same period, which we'll get to near the end of our discussion. But yeah, I'll just want to, sorry, a little bit of context there, and I'll pass it off to Ryan for his third example.
Yeah. Yeah. So another example which she uses, I mean, let's see, she uses a lot of examples, which are actually, there's the Monster of Troy vase, which is a vase depicting the sea monster which attacked Troy. Um, she supposes that it might be connected to was it some kind of giraffid skull or some ancient, maybe not giraffid, but some ancient prehistoric uh, skull, uh, which yeah, let's see, actually.
Yeah, I'm going to have to find that one. I'm familiar with Ogden's attempt to dismiss sea monster battles as shifts in narrative typology,
Yeah,
but I haven't heard that one before.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have her book with me just in case I need to go through it. But yeah, okay. So she argues. Yes. Okay, here we go. She tries to argue it might be a Samotherian skull, which was a giraffid that inhabited Samos uh, in the prehistoric era. And because she tries to compare it, she thinks or finds it to be an articulate um, depiction of the skull as if it were found as a skull. Um, Mind you, actually, her argument has been dismissed by people in her own field who credit her with attempting to do something innovative, but um, the find itself, like the monster at Troy vase, if you look it up online, you'll find what it is, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But it is just a kind of it. It is a highly stylized serpent, creature. And it was not. Again, the biggest problem is she relies on herself a bit too much to make expert or claims of expertise, or let's say expert claims, without consulting like semioticians or people involved in semiotics, or even people who who excel in, let's say, in Greek art, because ancient Greek art, because a lot of artists might tell you, well, that might be a nice theory, but actually it's so and so because of certain particular details here and there. Um, so again, her major argument, really, like her interpretation of Greek myth, is as an exercise in imaginative thinking, but also as a way to kind of prefigure scientific thought. Um, so those are just examples involving fossils. She'll also try to account, or let's see, she will attempt to interpret accounts of discoveries of giant bones in antiquity as, the discovering of fossils, which may or may not be true. It's hard to say though, given sometimes the nature of those kinds of arguments. Like there are accounts in antiquity, Greek and Roman accounts of, hey, we found the giant bones of so and so hero, or we found the giant bones which, yada yada, might overlap with certain Greek myths regarding like gigantomachyes or titanomachyes,
Yes.
battles involving giants and the gods.
Yeah,
Um, Sorry, continue.
I was going to say, one of the instances where we actually do know that Mayer was probably correct is in I would say it's a second, I think it's in Pausanias, where he talks about how the corpse of a centaur preserved in honey, I think it was
Yeah.
displayed in Rome. And Mayer argued that that was probably two corpses melded together. Um, that I think that was very fair, right?
Yeah.
Especially once you get funnily enough, especially once you get into what was a centaur and realize, again, we're probably not dealing with physical creatures. And it was only Pausanias writing at the end of the 2nd century AD, amidst the collapse of the polytheistic Roman world, who could just talk about centaur skeletons.
Yeah.
For the same reason. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean. Yeah, there is, I know similar arguments go on in Sinology about dragon bones, although it is absolutely agreed that dragon mythology predates any dinosaur bone discoveries.
Yes.
Because we have at least 1,000 years, if not more, of depictions of dragons in Chinese rock art and Chinese bone art, oracle bones, prior to the first written reference to dragons, and then from there it's another few centuries until we see any discussion of dragon bones. And that shows up in the context of people trying to sell the king's stuff as a cure-all. Because dragon bones were believed to have magical properties. That might not even have been dinosaur bones. They could have just been some random bone they found. Oh, dragon bones. But yeah, that'll be a better attested example.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we've provided, I guess Ryan has provided 3 really good examples. There is a consistent underarching theory, which we've already mentioned. But integral to this theory is a sort of hermeneutic attitude, right, towards myth. Which is, myths aren't real stories. They're not stories about things that happen in the physical world. We'll just accept that for the moment. It is probably true, but we'll just accept. And therefore, we have this large body globally, this large body of supernatural legends featuring things that can't possibly be real from the perspective of biology. One of the reasons the giant stuff gets brought up so often is because people that big would not be able to exist if they were actually made of flesh and blood, and therefore it's a prime example of something in mythology that can't be physically real. Same with fire. I mean, I've seen this for fire-breathing dragons. There actually is some argument that might be plausible, at least in the vermiform instance. But yeah, like fire-breathing dragons, gryphons, they're evolutionarily and biologically impossible, right? So we have all these legends. How do we approach them? And the temptation that a lot of moderns fall into, which goes back, and this is our intellectual heritage. I should say like as Westerners. I'm just going to make an assumption that most of the people watching this channel are live or identify as Westerners. This has very much been the heritage of the West in respect to myth, right? I mentioned somebody, Euhemerus was 3rd, even 4th century BC, so 2,400 years. And there have been more compelling interpretations of myth. We'll get into them in a moment. But one of the temptations that a lot of moderns fall into, for very historical reasons, this isn't something new, is to argue that, because these can't possibly be real, they must be a description of something else, and we're going to look behind the surface. I think I shouldn't say Mayer uses that, maybe Mayer's editor uses that in a lot of her book descriptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look beneath the surface of myth. That might not be Mayer, that might just be an editing gimmick, right?
Yeah.
Much in the same way that the famous French folklorist Claude Lécouteau keeps having his work translated into English under bizarre and sensationalist titles, whereas his actual names in French are much more normal. I cannot remember his name, but I have a book by a German folklorist. It was translated. It had the German name, German Religion and Overview, and it was translated into English as Barbarian Rites. So yeah, some of this stuff is editing. But yeah, look underneath the myth, and when we do this, we sort of break apart the myth itself. And it's like if you've been listening to this stream thus far, you will notice that these arguments have tended to focus on one or two features of the myth, while simultaneously erasing or ignoring 90% of the rest of the myth.
Yeah. And
these are all Greek examples, but I can bring up examples for all sorts of other people's myths where we do the same thing. And the question is, can we, it says in this channel that we are, in this channel's, or the videos, the channel rules paragraph in this YouTube video, sorry, it says that we are very committed to analyzing all the features of a claim, right, before we make any statements about it. This is a very important principle of philosophy of passing judgment, right? If you pass judgment upon an idea or upon a person and you don't know all the features, you can pass judgment wrongly. And especially outside, Western philosophy gets started in rhetoric as a tradition, which isn't to say anything negative about Western philosophers. Non-Western philosophy often gets started in the judiciary system, from the perspective of the people passing judgment, not from the lawyers. And so there, if you pass judgment wrongly, someone dies.
Yeah.
Right. And you've just killed a totally innocent person. Remembering that they had the death penalty in the ancient world. And so you see in a lot of philosophical traditions, this attitude is carried into sort of passing judgments on ideas or stories. And so then, is it possible for us to embrace Greek myth? Is it possible to analyze these as fully developed stories? Like looking at like we painted some very bizarre narratives just now, right? Like a man turning into a raven and going to the lands bordering the moon where Cyclops are fighting griffins. That sounds like it comes right out of a fantasy book.
Yeah.
In fact, really like Lord Dunsany or Howard Pyle, one of these turn of the century fantasy writers, turn of the last century. Some of all the giant, any stories involving. We didn't give the stories involving giants, but if you know your Greek myth, you've heard the details about like throwing mountains and snakes for leg. Like these are unbelievable at face value. Is there a way we can interpret them? Right. A sort of better way, shall we say. Did you want to take over here for a bit and talk a little bit about Greek myth and cult?
I think you know more than I do.
Okay. Real quickly before people get upset, I'm using cult in an anthropological sense, which just to connote a group of people who meet at a certain time in a certain place to perform religious observances. This isn't a pejorative. It's become a pejorative thanks to pseudoscientific psychology theories. But in the anthropological sense, it's not just a description; it can even be a compliment, right? The cult as an anthropological term comes, I think it was the Catholics, right? Who would describe the cult of the saints.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's where I could be wrong. I get that. I think that's where it entered the English language. But yeah, Greek myth. What we call Greek myth is a geographically and temporally diverse body of stories. Like these stretch, what was it, 1,200 years, 1,400 years, depending on how you want to date Homer. Maybe even longer. Because actually, there's arguments that Homer preserved Mycenaean mythology. So potentially 2,000 years, from 1450 BC to 450 AD, because the last major work of Greek mythology that I know of is the Dionysiaca by Nonnus. There's a few other minor ones, but nothing. And then by that point, it's mostly Christians. Like John Lidas, for instance, was an excellent compiler of Greek myth who lived 200 years after Greek polytheism had died out. Often correct, though, to give credit where credit is due. But anywho, very temporally diverse, very spatially diverse, because this comes from the entire Greek world. We don't really we have stories from Sicily, we have stories from what is now Turkey, we have stories from Greece proper, we have stories from places what is now Albania, Croatia, North Macedonia, Spain, France. Like this was the extent of the Greek world. Egypt, right? And we have legends from all of these, and it would be a mistake to make a sweeping claim about all of Greek myth. But a great number of the myths that have passed down to us are what we may call a hieros logos, a sacred story, which is the sort of they were narratives often recited or recounted or tied to very specific festivals and events at which I'm slightly overgeneralizing here. People would undergo initiations, or sometimes they were just there to explain the event. So, but we're more interested in the ones that have to do with initiations here. The various legends connected to the Eleusinian mysteries are a good example, with the kidnapping of Persephone by Hades, the story of Aphrodite and Adonis is another one that's tied to the There's several different variants of that story, all of them tied to the Phrygian cult of the Great Mother of the Mountains, Mata Magner. Most of the stories involving Dionysus, the story of Cadmus and Harmonia, which is connected to the Samothrakists, a small, call it small, actually a society, a massive temple, small island, but massive temple, located on Samothrace in between, just around Turkey, so on and so forth. And so a lot of our Greek legends and stories are not actually intended to provide, features of agriculture or explanations of scientific phenomena as much as they are to provide, say, they're stories that are intimately connected to these religious observances. We still do this today, right? With Easter and Passover and Christmas. Maybe not Christmas because of Santa, but Christmas. I don't know enough about Islamic holiday law to provide any other examples. I can think of some Chinese examples, but they're from the 3rd century AD, and I have no idea what's going on nowadays, to be rather candid. But yes, the very common attitude. And so if we go all the way back to ancient Greek myth, I mentioned at the start of it, like, we can't take myths literally. It just leads to just all sorts of weird conclusions. We can't take them literally from an emic perspective either. So there's the etic perspective, which is us, moderns, secular or irreligious, not especially inclined to metaphysical realities, and trusting more in science and rational thought than in various, other forms of knowledge, which isn't to denigrate any of that or anyone else, just a description of a very overgeneralized and often false description of how we tend to look at the world. So that's the etic, and then there's going to be the emic, which is how did ancient Greek religious enthusiasts celebrating their own religion see what they were doing. And you don't have to cling to the etic in your interpretations, but you should always pay it respect, because this is what people were actually doing and what they thought they were doing. And it should especially inform your etic interpretation before you ride roughshod over them. Because I mentioned, we can't take them literally. And so the question arises, what do we do? Right? We got with the euhemerist interpretation, and then we had another interpretation in Greek myth, which was sort of allegorical. And unfortunately, both of these other views were academic, and they didn't really succeed in sufficing as what we call explananda. They did not explain the thing that we desired to be explained, which is why people fought over them bitterly and then they died out. And this is rather unfortunate, not because I want these views back, but because if you look at what's actually going on in ancient myth per their own texts, these are often very clearly ritual plans for all sorts of things. I keep talking about visions because I think that's the easiest way to approach myths as someone who's a foreigner to these sorts of things, because we're not ancient Greeks. We are looking at an other, to use a bit of Hawnian terminology. But, yeah, we're sort of a visionary tradition. The plain view would be that salvation was the desired effect of a lot of these sort of religious institutions. This view is not very popular in academia right now. There's a lot. It was argued heavily against by a theorist called Walter Burkert in the 80s, and an astonishing number of classicists today are his disciples or were trained by his disciples or otherwise influenced by him. So you will not often see salvation or soteriology come up in discussions of mystery cults. That's starting to change. It is starting to change, but for a while that was excluded. But yes, like the story, the Mithraic tauroctony, for instance, the story of Mithras killing the bull, which all of us have heard of because it shows up on your hardline atheist cousin's Facebook page every Christmas. But most of us don't know too much about. Was in fact all but definitely a visionary, an attempt to induce visions, which we know not simply because of the structure of the myth, but because of the archaeology of the Mithraea itself, which were designed. We have the Mithraic tauroctony at the very center, in front of a table where the Mithraists would eat the sacred meeting. And this is underground, right? So it's in pitch black, and they would manipulate the lighting through often through torches shaped like lions. I'm sure they had other methods. It was a very diverse religion, not the modern sense, just in the sense that they were on 3 continents. And this is in the ancient world where it takes a year to send a letter. So very just diverse in that sense. And we know from this coupled with the sort of iconography that they were probably, and a sketchy and highly controversial text called the Mithras Liturgy, which I won't get into, that they were probably engaged in visionary ascents using this icon of Mithras and the unfortunately mostly lost story of the Mithraic tauroctony. Right. I could provide some other examples here, like Dionysus is a great one. I will refrain from providing instance after instance and simply note, for instance, that we can see our 3 examples were gryphons, giants. I'm blanking on the third. What was the third one you brought up?
Of what?
So we discussed gryphons.
Yeah.
We discussed
Gryphons, Cyclops, and the Monster of Troy.
Oh, the Monster of Troy. Thank you. Yeah. I'm not going to discuss the Monster of Troy here because that one's a little more ephemeral. There are interesting but highly controversial arguments involving what role here the mythologies of heroes, remembering that heroes were worshipped as demigods in the ancient world, which we've talked about. See our stream on the Nephilim for more. Sorry. But yeah, I will not get into the highly controversial and hotly contested terrain of like what are hero stories and what are they trying to tell us, and is there anything we can learn from these? And we will, I guess, talk about giants and griffins. Both of these comport very clearly either to ritual mythic cycles or to, I mean, in the case of the griffins one, that's very clearly a vision.
Yeah.
To the point that it's almost explicit. All but explicit. Like Herodotus is 1 or 2 words away from just making it totally explicit. So yeah, that one very clearly a vision. A lot of giant lore tends to be the same thing. Right? You have this mighty combat between the forces of good and the forces of evil, which is in this case the giants, embodiments of chaos. Not that actually, maybe that's not a good example, because the Cyclops are not necessarily embodiments of chaos. They have a really weird position.
Well, they're both servants of the gods, but they can also revile them. So there's 3 I actually think they're all interconnected, but that's later. But yeah, servants of the gods, but also, they're kind of they're antagonistic sometimes as well. So they do have chaos elements, but they're also kind of weirdly in between.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
that also demonstrates another, and I mentioned when I got into this analysis of myth that, like, I don't think we can make a categorical statement about what ancient myth is. I think there are things we can say it's not. Recollections of dinosaur bones, summaries of natural phenomena, um, highly elaborate star lore. Oh, so there's a few other modern theories that are ever so delightful. Um, but any account of ancient Greek myth has to have take into account that we actually have several different types of stories, and some of them, are to be. I guess approach this from a purely skeptical standpoint. Are not meant to, they're not meant to induce visions or to explain the natural world or to say, why a given tree, ideological myths, like why is that tree there? As much as they are to explain other elements of the theology, right? Because the Cyclops are the armors of Zeus.
Yeah.
Who, he both supplants the old order of the gods, the Titans, and then defeats the giants twice. Right.
Yeah.
He wins 2 Gigantomachyes against Typhon and against the giants that came after Typhon. Unless I flipped that around.
Yeah, actually, it
No,
was before. No, the Giants came before.
yeah, sorry.
Because after, yeah, they came before because it was after they were all killed that Gaia mated with Tartarus and produced Typhon.
Oh, but then didn't she produce the other? There was another one with 2 giants.
Oh, the Aloa died?
Yes, who
That
weren't
was
killed by
from,
Zeus. They were killed.
yeah. I don't think they were part of the main war.
Yeah, they were later. They were
They were
after
later, yeah.
Typhon.
And they are, yeah, chaos figures.
Yes. Yeah, so we have three fights against giants amongst innumerable smaller ones. In 2 of them, Zeus shows up and he schmucks them with his lightning bolts. Who's making those lightning bolts for Zeus? The Cyclops. What are the Cyclops? A type of giant.
Yeah.
And also, they're also children of Kronos.
No, Children of Uranus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, no, they are a result of the Heroes Gamos marriage between Uranus and Gaia at the beginning of the world. So
Sorry.
along with the Hecatonchires, yeah, along with the
Yes, yeah, it was the 100-handed Antinous. Yes, sorry. I don't know why I gaffed on that one because that was why Gaia told Kronos to go for the ball, go for
yeah,
his dad's. Yeah,
because
it
Uranus
was
was like, ah, giants! I don't like these giants, and he hid them away. Like,
yes.
go away, go away.
So this is actually a sort of sophisticated theological commentary, interweaving Zeus's kingship in with all sorts of other elements of Greek belief.
Yeah,
Right.
yes,
Yeah. He both inherits the old order from Kronos and from Uranus. Oh no, obligatory teehee.
no,
Sorry, he both inherits the old order and he gives it its proper due in a way that the old masters were not, right?
yeah,
Capable of doing. And this is both a political statement and a metaphysical one. Which isn't to say that they invented Cyclops to do that. Simply that I think a much more compelling account of Cyclops and various legends would start with that in mind.
yeah. Oh, I just realized there might be a connection between the Aloadai, Gilgamesh, and Nimrod.
Huh.
So I was looking. So I was kind of looking this stuff up while you were talking, just to make sure everything was on track. And the
Yes.
Aloadai are often depicted as wielding hunting spears when they were facing off against Artemis, who took on the form of a deer. So there's
Yes.
like a
And then they
because
skewer themselves.
yeah, they skewered themselves. Yes, but that's a lot of very evocative hunter imagery. And Nimrod, was a hunter, right? So there
Um,
might be a hunting myth behind that.
yeah, maybe something to look in. See if we can
Yes, yes. Sorry.
find something stronger than that. But yeah,
Well, yeah.
yeah.
Well, they're depicted as hunters, right? So that
No, no,
again,
yeah,
that's evocative. Well, yeah, that just yeah.
yeah. It could just. I mean, yeah, it
So
could be
again,
also.
still, again, you have to really take imagery into account before going off and saying, "Oh, bones, fossils, pre-scientific thinking," because it's
Well, yeah,
very, very cultic.
and yeah, and that's part of the issue with attempting to explain this stuff is dinosaur bones or whatever racial memories of Neanderthals. Um, is there's just no reason to posit it. Like
Yeah,
we know why a lot of these stories exist, right? We know when they were written and for whom. Uh, like the Eleusinian, the story of the kidnapping of Demeter, the kidnapping of Persephone by Hades, the kidnapping of Demeter by very different me. That is very much a myth deeply connected to the cultic rites of the Eleusinian mysteries, which isn't to say they made it up for their mysteries, but there's no need to go about finding dinosaur bones to explain their own cultic myths, right?
yeah.
The cultic myth is there because it's the cultic myth. But yeah, so with that in mind, uh, I guess your problems of reading myth, and before you even want to get into these things, you also want to start approaching things from like how do they think about the world.
Yeah.
A lot of these accounts produce or a lot of these modern arguments about various ancient myths or legends are it's absolutely fascinating how little the surrounding culture, the ancient culture, seems to have impacted their reading of the myth. Right, like ancient Greece is not modern America or Canada or
No.
Swaziland, wherever you live. It is a totally different culture with totally different customs and totally different ways of thinking about the world. Not just um, in terms of your values, like they had all sorts of values that we would consider well, some of them we would just not have, uh, and others we would consider abhorrent, and they on their part would not have liked quite a number of our customs. uh, but there's also ways of thinking, because I mentioned this earlier, like we generally in the West, we are not inclined to give divination much credence. Of course,
No.
you're going to find people, sometimes very major, important people, who are exceptions to this, but we do not usually consult diviners if we want to know about reality. Right. It takes very little knowledge of ancient Greece to see that this was not the case back then for them. A lot of our records from ancient Greece have to do with their absolute belief that diviners are real, that diviners are going to give you useful information. Maybe you will interpret that wrong because of the sketchy language of diviners, with the infamous example of King Croesus. Um, but yeah, certainly we tend to see, at least amongst the peasantry, an abiding belief that divination is a way of knowing, right? It's a way of thinking about the world, often in connection to, dream visions. There's some weirdness involving gas. Weirdness because we haven't actually been able to find the gas that they were purportedly using. Um, really strange, that one, but yeah, a lot of stuff involving dreams, like bird flight, uh, and you see all this. I mean, scattered throughout mythology. It's scattered throughout their works of history, right?
Hmm.
Like Now, most of us are not generally inclined to take the words of visionary shamans and put them in our history books. Herodotus did. Herodotus, he took the words of a vision, or he took stories attributed to a visionary seer, and he put them in his history book. And he was ripped up by the Greek rationalists for that, but he wasn't ripped apart by his own contemporaries. They were just like, oh, yep. Elsewhere I think it's even in the same chapter, he talks about sort of how he was initiated. Herodotus was a member of the Samothracists. I mentioned them earlier. Mystery cult from Samothrace worshipped the union of the Great Mother, and with the they worshipped a set of deities called the Great Gods of Samothrace, who were especially associated with salvation for sailors from storms. Remembering how often people died at sea in those times, right? Why was there such a wildly popular religion? They had a number of other stories. Their Hieros Logos was centered around someone they called Cadmilos and Harmonia, which gets interpretatio Graecate as Cadmus and Harmonia. But they claimed it was Hermes. And they were known for claiming to sort of have unified heaven and earth, and for having a mystery cult heavily centered on moral teachings. And their members would meet across the ancient world they had little clubs. Herodotus was a Samothraciist, and I think I'd have to pull open the book and check. I think it's in the exact same book as Aristeas, where he cites his visions from the cult of the main festival of Samothrace as a source on the meaning of herm, of a type of ancient stone called a herm, which were giant, rather impressive sculptures to Hermes that were set up at various locations throughout Greece. That's all I'll say about Herms. You'll look up Herms and you'll go, oh. Yeah. But yeah. Sorry. But my point is, this was a way of knowing. It was still a way of knowing even at the tail end of Greek civilization. Like, for all the rationalists went at it, you still had Greek philosophers like Artemidorus and Iamblichus, who as late as the 4th century were willing to go to bat for the truth of visionary experiences. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And their use in metaphysics. So we were deducing entire claims about reality from people who went into sort of trance states. And one of the disciple of Iamblichus even became Roman emperor. Right? This would be the Emperor Julian Fidei Defensor, who also talks about receiving vision. He talks about having been saved. The previous emperor attempted to kill him, and it was only because of a vision of the gods telling him to get out of the building in time that he escaped being brutally murdered. So yeah, he cites a visionary tradition, and at that point, the Greek religion had largely entered its final decline. Not a little over about 30 years later, the Christian emperor Theodosius would formalize state persecution of polytheists. But you do still have Greek philosophers citing visionary, the handful that remained polytheists citing visionary traditions into the 6th century. Nor was it really rejected from Western philosophy for another 1,000 years. So yeah, that's just one example of the types of difficulties you get when you try to read somebody else's myth, and it's not and you have to step into their inner world and see how do they think, how do they feel, what does it mean to be them before you can really get a firm grasp. Even then, it's a lot of work. This was not the best showing on this stream. at least for me. But that aside, one instance actually where this has been done really well, to tie, if I can tie this, did you have anything else you want to bring up, Ryan, or can I proceed to the final topic of the stream?
Yeah, I think you said most of what needed to be said. I did want to give maybe a couple more examples of where she kind of goes wrong. Mostly that's in her other book on ancient robots. But this one is more just a general overview approach and kind of, I mean, we'll probably get into what you're saying soon enough, but her interpretation again of Greek myth, like in her books on robots, um, it's like you know like Greek myth just prefigures science, right? It's just scientific thinking. It's proto science almost. Um, she will like interpret the account of Jason and Medea and the lamb that gets brought up there with the king. Oh, I have to remember which one it was, but um, uh, I don't know. I can't find it. But sorry, but basically she oh, I can't find it. I'm so sorry. Uh,
Tragic.
oh, actually, so there's an episode in the Argonaut story um, where she thinks Medea, the sorceress, who brings a lamb back to life through the use of a dismembered ram, anticipated genetic manipulation and cloning, and that is just a perfect example of how not to interpret Greek myth.
Yeah, especially given, I mean, we have rock solid evidence that the story of Jason and the Argonauts was originally a Hyros logos. The tragically lost earliest version was an Orphic cosmology. It was an Orphic legend used in their religious centers.
Oh well,
Yeah, yeah.
oh well.
Unfortunately, that particular story gets lost. We have a later Orphic Argonautica, but that's like fourth. I think it's 4th century A.D. So it's. I mean, at that point, the Orphics didn't even exist anymore, and it was just some lone philosopher writing lone Orphic philosopher writing his last interpretation. But we do know that that was originally what it was. And the reason the Argonautica has played such a powerful role in later religious thinking, both Greek and Christian, and even Muslim, uh, is precisely because of it. Because all of the symbolism in the Jason and the Argonaut story lends itself so well to religious impressions, right?
Yeah.
You have the tree with the fleece of light, the fleece on it, and he has to fight a dragon to get it. He wins through supernatural aid. You see this in so many. I mean, well, it's very Indo-European,
Oh yes.
but
Well,
you
that's
see,
the cauldron of resuscitation.
yeah,
That has nothing to do. Oh my goodness, that has
yeah,
nothing to do with genetic engineering. She thinks it prefigures Dolly the sheep. Like what?
yeah. And there are instances, for the record, where we do know that something prefigured something else in science, right? Like Leibniz, who 17th, 18th century philosopher, best known for his discovery of calculus, also famously invented a binary system of computation. that absolutely prefigures modern computation. Like later developers of computers, such as Babbage, George Boole, were working with Leibniz's writings, and then they built the. I mean, they didn't build computers because this was 1850, but they built stuff that would later become computers 100 years on. So this was a 300-year journey of people where you could say Leibniz prefigured Boole's theories about computation and Babbage's, and you'd be perfectly correct, right?
Yeah.
Leibniz wouldn't be upset if he heard you say that either. He'd be like, "Yeah, that's what I was doing. He completed what I didn't have time to." Slash access to technology. Slash not dying in a horrible religious war.
Oh, actually, Medea's cutting up of the lamb and putting it into water and then applying that. So in folklore, we've read the waters of life, right? Where dismembered people get rejuvenated through water.
Yeah.
That's probably what that is.
Well, I figured because normally I see that interpreted in line with the general shamanic motif of dismemberment and reassembly.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No.
But not to say that you're the other, yeah.
Well, that's what that is. Also,
Oh yeah.
remember, Claude Lecoteau brings this up on his book on the double. But also remember in Carlo Ginzburg's account where that one, I don't know if it was like the goddess spirit patron or if it was a member of the Benedonti, but remember how they were able to resurrect an animal by touching it with a rod?
Yeah.
Yes. And then there's the myth of Thor bringing back his goats with Mjolnir.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
so that might be what that. Okay.
yeah. Well,
Ah, yes.
who wrote The Reindeer People? Because he documented contemporary religious rites in Siberia that use the exact same sort of motif. Which isn't to say that that's what's going on in Jason, but that like the dismembered and reassembled body is a very well established symbol, which of course changes slightly depending on Piers Vitebsky's The Reindeer People.
Mm.
Okay book. It has some problems. He has a bad habit of saying they've forgotten their own mythology, which I have been, and then applying something that they don't believe to them. But a good book, very good book, very good overview of contemporary Siberian shamanism. So this is recent. This is recent stuff, and it is the same motif as Thor, involving putting the dismembered animal back again and touching it with a rod. Obviously, in their case, they don't believe they will literally resurrect the animal. They're hoping its spirit will return to the collective, I guess, group of animals, be selectively reincarnated. Selective because they don't think this happens to people. So for the sake of sustaining them food-wise, right?
Yeah.
Like if you survive based off hunting, you want there to be herds of deer, but you also have to kill those herds of deer.
Yeah.
Which creates the sort of paradox. There's a famous Inuit idiom, we live only by stealing from others.
Yeah.
Lives by harming something else. One of the two. Something like that. It may not even be Inuit. It just gets quoted across Canada as Inuit wisdom. Very consonant with Inuit religion in mythology, but may not actually be Inuit in origin. But yeah, there are several.
It sounds Marxist, to be honest.
That's true. We all live through theft.
Yeah.
No, because it's recognition of it still involves the recognition of property, eh?
Yeah, oh yeah.
The reason it tends to get associated with the Inuit is because of religious rites expressing gratitude to the animal for associated with for the kill.
Mm.
At least, and this is just this is oral lore from me. So there's not a source on that one. This is what scholars have told me. But as I said, that could be entirely modern mythology. So very good. Anywho, like you can see, there's a variety of meanings that the fleece and the sort of dicing the ram might have. All of them are going to be connected, though, to that same symbolic act of dismemberment and rebirth, right?
Yeah.
Whether it has some visionary component, or it's a philosophical metaphor, or it's even just a literary device. Like, even if it's just a literary device, it's a literary device that gets its power from that symbolic connection. I always like to joke about Harry Potter and Jesus, because like just how many features of Jesus show up in Harry Potter, right? And yet nobody could ever interpret Harry Potter as a religious text, or at least a text that was written to be religious. It's just using self-consciously, like Rowling knows her folklore, self-consciously using those motifs. But with that being said, would you be willing if we went to Sumer now?
Sure.
Yeah. So we will cap this off by talking about an instance where you can find, I want to say proto-science, like proto-science or quasi-science or science with an asterisk, whatever you want to call it, in ancient mythology. And we're going to look at Mesopotamian studies, which is the field of studies that examines the 4,000-year history of Sumer. Ryan, did you want to say anything about Finkel, or should I launch with?
You can launch. You can launch.
Okay, I will
can
launch.
interject. Yeah, I can interject whenever.
Yeah. So Sumerian mythology. I would say if you're into mythology, you have at least encountered the Epic of Gilgamesh, maybe one or two other Sumerian myths. In some cases, we have a pretty good idea that these texts had a practical purpose. In others, they have totally different purposes. But one of the interesting things about Sumerian mythology is it was the basis of their scribal curriculum. And Sumer, very literate, very intellectual society. It was the basis of their scribal curriculum. And thus, we actually happen to know from our surviving cuneiform tablets from Sumer that these were these were myths, but they were also philosophical tracts. And Sumerian scribes they learned how to write. They also learned philosophy by studying the sort of meanings of these words. There's a famous book by Van de Meerup examining, for instance, the nexus of myths connected to Marduk on this topic, called Philosophy Before the Greeks. They also did this with, we know Sumerian mythology is connected to astronomy and to astrology, and there is broad consensus in Mesopotamian studies, which of course, take that as you will, because the consensus is often wrong, but there's broad consensus that Sumerian astrology and astronomy/astrology, there's no division in the ancient world, and physiognomy, which of course there is a distinction between that and physiology, was firmly grounded within, as I said, what we will call the proto-scientific, or the quasi-scientific, or the scientific, or the scientific, but now I've put an asterisk at the end, method. Namely, all the features you would have been taught in your high school and even university science class about how the scientific method as understood by Karl Popper, which is the method as we tend to teach it today. Sort of criterion of falsification, hypothetico-deductive, so on and so forth. That this was in fact present behind Sumerian astrology, and that Sumerian myths they're not scientific texts. Like, they are very clearly myths, and they do the same things that Greek myths do, that the Hebrew myths do, that Indian myths do. But they are very clearly connected to this sort of scientific analysis, scientific with an asterisk, if you would
Mm-hmm.
like to, yeah. And that in there, I will leave physiognomy aside, because that's going to be the more controversial one. But if you look at their sort of approaches to astrology and their approaches to mythology and how they exegeted myths, you will find a very consistent. Well, you'll find three things. You'll find a mythical hermeneutic, right? You'll find a philosophy, both in the sense of sort of metaphysical doctrines about the world and an ethical teachings derived therefrom, especially in respect to they're called the Mies, right?
Yeah.
The Mies, which are sort of divine decrees given to man by the gods, decrees/gifts. This shows up, for instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it's like we look at the gods doing these horrible things to Gilgamesh, and we're like, oh man, the gods, they must have thought the gods were like bad people. Nope. This is the sort of divine Mies philosophy going on in the background, right? They were, I mean, the attitudes towards the gods differed across time, but to overgeneralize, we might talk about who are we to question the divine attitude. You see this in other myths too. Gilgamesh is just one of the best examples. Like the whole atrahasis, it's the gods don't really take responsibility for their screw up. You're like, oh. But they give the Mies to the survivors who pass them on. Anywho, you have a threefold system here, right? You have the mythic, the mythology, which again, all the normal myths. There's a couple texts that I think are probably visionary. You got the Epic of Gilgamesh. You have the Marduk Tiamat cycle, which I think we agree that that's a nationalistic.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's just Babylon. Yeah.
Yeah, and basically a nationalistic myth, sort of national pride. Yeah, you got the usual run, and then you have all the philosophies that derived from this, which don't show up in our translations because we're not translating random scribal remarks in like the footnotes. Sometimes we do, but yeah, we have the sort of philosophy that takes place in the margins, connected to this. I mentioned, the divine Mies, theories of kingship, civilization versus the wild. That's a popular Sumerian concept. What it means to be a good warrior. I could go on and on. Those are the most obvious, but there are certainly others. And then you have a scientific element connected to astrology. Science with an asterisk. Good to see the heavenly writing by Francesca Rochberg for the best analysis of this. I think she has two books on this topic. Let me. It was Before Nature, Cuneiform Knowledge and the History of Science. Because the interesting thing about the Sumerians is they did not have an idea of nature. And yet they were able to do all this without nature. But sorry, that aside, Rochberg presents a very good overview and, to my mind, a very compelling argument that this represents. You can call it you can either call it the scientific method or a primitive form of the scientific method if you are so inclined. She takes this as an argument for scientific relativism. Broadly put, the view that scientific statements are not descriptive of reality and are merely relevant to cultural contexts. I'm not a hardline scientific realist, but I think it would be pretty easy to get out of that one, just by noting that science is not concerned with metaphysical statements. I think that's all you really need to do. Um, so I don't think a scientific realist would be too troubled by her. At least a good scientific realist. I think she successfully skewers the whole. The wonderful thing about science is that it doesn't matter if you believe in it types, but they have no compelling theory. They just have no compelling idea of what it is, what science is, or what it means to be a scientist. So can ignore them. But yeah, we have this sort of sophisticated astronomical, astrological theory going on in the background that does get connected to their myths, especially Inanna. She gets connected to tied into quite a few of these through Venus. But yeah, and so we can see here how actually you can sort of find a proto-scientific reflection in ancient myth, and you can do so without desecrating the myths themselves.
Yeah.
Like Rochberg's findings, and I want to say Rayner. Hold up, what's her first name again? Rayner. Oh, Reiner. Erica Reiner, Astral Magic in Babylonia. Irving Finkel has a similar argument in both his books, a few of his books.
Yeah, his book on the original Mesopotamian flood. That one. And his
Yes.
book on ghosts.
Yeah, they were very methodical exorcists.
Oh, yes.
Reiner vets Finkel's findings in Astral Magic in Babylonia
Mm-hmm.
when she talks about Sumerian exorcistic methods. But yeah, of course, these are not the sort of things we would usually put into science, and we may be tempted to look. And I'm not, to be very clear, before people type out an angry 500-word comment, I'm not claiming that astrology is scientific. Let's just be clear here. Merely that you can use the scientific method while believing in astrology, which isn't false. So, anywho, we can see here you can interpret these as being profoundly connected to an analysis of the empirical world, to pick a more neutral designator before I get really angry tirades in the comments, and still preserve the underlying mythic themes. In fact, the Sumerians never saw any contradiction with this, which is the more important part of this whole discussion. Like before I get an angry 500-word comment about physiognomy, that the Sumerians existed for 4,000 years, approximately, as a civilization that we know of, from 3600 BC to about 300, 400 AD. Of course, at that point, there's not much left. But they existed for all that time, and they passed down what was to them a very sophisticated tradition connecting philosophy, mythology, and empirical studies, we will call them, whether true or not, that they saw no contradiction. They saw no contradiction. Whatever you happen to think about any of these three things, like if you hate philosophy or are really opposed to myth, they themselves existed for longer than the West, to be blunt. Existed for longer than the West did, and in all that time, they never saw any contradiction between these three things. And so if you're analyzing Sumerian myth, yeah, you maybe not the cloning argument. And I don't think dinosaur bones would quite fly, but you can see a connection to a sort of proto-scientific method. Anything to add on to that?
Nope.
Yeah, I don't think such a thing's really ever going to fly in Greece, because the only people we have who we can attest were doing science were either uninterested in myths or giving them really goofy interpretations that are known to be wildly false. Cough, cough. Was it Plutarch's analysis of Isis and Osiris. think it was may have been Pliny. If it was Pliny, that proves my point even better, because he was a scientist. But yeah, I don't think you can really do that with Greek myth. You can with Sumerian or Mesopotamian. Sorry, you arguably can with Jewish and Chinese. I won't. I don't know enough about Indian, so I won't comment. But yeah, that's about it. And you can sort of see how this, just to recapitulate our general perspective, how, like, it's not simply the argument that's wrong, it's the sort of attitude to the external world, and claims made in the external world. And this, it shows up when people don't care. Really, if I have to be blunt, a little rude, a little blunt about it, people are most likely to endorse these sorts of rationalizations when they don't care for something and are trying to find a way around it. And if you look at this thought process in real life with your contemporaries in politics and religion and economics and business, you will find that they are trying not to wrestle with the not to wrestle with the dragon, basically.
Mm-hmm.
If you have nothing else to add, Ryan, I'm going to call it here.
All right, that's good. No, I think that summarizes it nicely.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I've been Wild Philosopher. He has been Ryan Rose. And with that, well, I'm going to wish you all a wonderful evening. And always remember that fairies are real.
Yes.